There are nights on the Texas high plains when the wind doesn't blow and the coyotes don't call, and the silence gets so complete you can hear your own heartbeat like a question you're afraid to answer. Earl Briggs had been living inside that silence for 9 months. 9 months since the house stopped having another person in it. 9 months since he'd had a reason to cook a full meal, or leave a light on in the front room, or say anything out loud before noon. And tonight, on a moonless November night with the temperature dropping fast and something moving wrong in the dark beyond the hay barn, that silence broke. He heard it before he saw it, a sound so small and so fierce it seemed impossible. A cat, his cat, screaming. Not yowling the way barn cats do when they're establishing territory or chasing field mice through the walls. Screaming. The kind of sound that bypasses the thinking brain and lands directly in the part of you that is still underneath everything, an animal. Earl Briggs was 74 years old with a bad left knee and a heart that had been through more than hearts are designed for. But he was off the porch and moving toward that barn in the dark before the second sound had finished. Whatever was out there, Juniper was between it and the farm, and Earl Briggs was not gonna let her face it alone. 6 months before that November night, Earl Briggs was a man doing a convincing impression of a man who was fine. He woke at 5 because the body doesn't care that there's no longer a reason. He made 1 cup of coffee in a pot designed for 2. He went out and fed the horses and checked the fence line along the east pasture and did every single thing in exactly the order he and Margaret had divided it between them for 41 years, except he did it all now, both halves, because there was no other option and because staying busy was the only medication that didn't require a prescription. The Briggs Ranch, 240 acres of High Plains, Texas, north of Amarillo, was still standing. The cattle were healthy, the fences held. From the road, it looked like nothing had changed. Inside the farmhouse, everything had. The other coffee cup was still on its hook. Her boots were still beside the back door. Earl couldn't move them, couldn't explain why to himself except that moving them would mean something that he wasn't ready for it to mean. Out in the hay barn, Juniper lived the way she had always lived, independent, useful, completely unbothered by human emotional weather. She kept the barn clear of mice and rats. She came and went on her own schedule. She had accepted the occasional can of tuna from Margaret with a kind of professional courtesy. She had no idea that the woman who had always brought the tuna was gone. She had no idea the man coming out to the barn every morning was doing it half out of habit and half because the barn was the only place on the property where he didn't expect to hear Margaret's voice. The encounter that changed everything happened the way most things that matter happen. Quietly, without announcement, in the middle of something completely ordinary. It was a Tuesday morning in late May, the kind of day that is already hot before 7 a.m., and Earl had gone out to the barn to move some hay bales from the east stack to the west rack where he could reach them without the bad step-up his knee no longer tolerated. He'd been working for about 20 minutes when he turned around and found Juniper sitting on top of a hay bale approximately 4 feet from where he'd been working, not doing anything, not asking for anything, just sitting there. He had seen her 100 times, 1,000 times. She was barn furniture almost, part of the operational equipment of the place. But he noticed something in that moment he hadn't noticed before. She was watching him the way she watched field mice before a move, still, precise, fully committed to understanding the thing in front of her. Not like prey, like a problem she was working on. Earl straightened up and looked at her. "What?" he said. His own voice surprised him. He hadn't said anything out loud since the previous afternoon. Juniper held his gaze for a long and serious moment, those pale amber green eyes completely level. And then she stood up, turned around twice, and lay down on top of the hay bale facing him, tucking her front paws under her chest in that compact way cats do when they have decided to stay somewhere for a while. Earl stood in the middle of his barn looking at his barn cat and didn't move for longer than made any sense. Then he went back to work, but he didn't feel quite as alone in the room as he had before.
He didn't plan it. That's the important thing to understand. Earl Briggs was not a man who made sentimental decisions. He'd grown up on this land when it was harder than it is now, when animals were assets, and sentiment about them was something you kept private if you had any at all. His father had taught him that. The ranch taught him that every year after. But on the fourth day of Juniper sitting on that hay bale watching him work, he came out to the barn at noon, and he had Margaret's old ceramic bowl, the blue one with the crack in it that Margaret had kept meaning to throw away for 6 years and never did. And he had a can of tuna fish and a can opener, and he set it on the top of the hay bale and stepped back. Juniper looked at the bowl, looked at him, looked at the bowl. Then she walked over with her crooked tail raised and ate in that unhurried, precise way that cats have that makes even eating look like something they decided to do, not something they needed. Earl sat down on an overturned 5-gallon bucket and watched her eat, and didn't ask himself why he was doing it, didn't examine it. He stayed there until she finished. When she was done, she sat down 3 inches from the empty bowl, licked her right paw, and then placed that paw very deliberately on top of Earl's knee. She kept it there for almost a full minute. Earl looked down at it, that small, warm weight. He hadn't been touched in 9 months. He didn't move. He didn't want to be the reason she stopped.
Margaret Elaine Briggs died on the 14th of September, a Wednesday, at 6:22 in the morning, in the bedroom she and Earl had shared for 41 years. Pancreatic cancer, diagnosed in June, dead by September. The disease had moved through her the way fire moves through dry grass, fast, total, and without negotiation. Earl had held her hand. He had been there for every single minute the doctors said mattered, and for a great many minutes they hadn't mentioned. He had said everything he needed to say, which he understood was more than most people get, and which did not make it easier by even a fraction of a degree. What nobody tells you about losing someone after 41 years is that grief is not one thing. It is several 100,000 small things. It is the other side of the bed. It is her handwriting on the grocery list, still stuck to the refrigerator under a magnet they bought at Carlsbad Caverns in 1987. It is going to say something out loud, something small, something you've said 1,000 times, and the space where her response would have been. Earl Briggs had been a stoic man his entire life, not cold but contained. It was how he'd been built. He had no children, a grief of its own, quiet and long since settled, and his brother in Midland had his own health difficulties. The neighbors were kind but distant in the way ranch neighbors are. He was alone on 240 acres in a way that had its own specific, particular weight. And in the barn, a cat who had never been asked to be anything more than a barn cat was beginning, without anyone asking her, to be something more.
Juniper did not know she was performing therapy. She would have been offended by the idea. She was doing what she had always done, working. The hay barn had a rat problem that spiked every summer when the heat drove the rodents in from the open fields. and Juniper addressed it with the kind of systematic, unhurried professionalism that made her the most reliably useful resident of the Briggs Ranch. Earl started noticing it, really noticing it, paying attention in a way he hadn't before. She was methodical, patient. She would sit at a particular spot along the north wall for 40 minutes without moving, reading something in the air or the sound or the vibration of the floor that Earl's human senses couldn't access. And then she would move with a speed and precision that seemed to belong to a different, faster animal than the one that had been sitting still. Earl started talking to her while she worked, not asking her questions exactly, just narrating the weather forecast, what needed doing on the east fence, his assessment of how the hay yield was going to look this year, what the cattle prices were doing. Juniper worked and listened and occasionally looked at him with her pale amber-green eyes in a way that suggested she had opinions but was keeping them professional. Earl started looking forward to the barn. Not just going to the barn, looking forward to it. There's a difference. Anyone who has spent time in grief knows the difference.
It was a Sunday evening in July, the summer stretching out hot and long the way Texas summers do when it happened. Earl had been inside all afternoon, going through the filing cabinet in the spare room. Insurance papers, ranch documents, the slow, bureaucratic unwinding of a shared life that nobody warned you about. It had been a brutal afternoon. He came out to the barn at dusk because he needed to be somewhere that wasn't that room. He sat down in the old wooden chair he'd put out there sometime in the spring, a ladder-back chair from the farmhouse kitchen that had found itself relocated the way things do on a working ranch. And he sat there in the cooling evening with his hat in his hands and his wide head bowed and the barn going dark around him. And Juniper jumped up onto the arm of the chair. She had never done that before. She looked at him for a moment, that direct amber-green assessment, and then she walked across his lap and settled herself against his right side, between his arm and his ribs, with her head pressed against his chest, above his heart. Earl sat very still. The barn was quiet. Outside, the Texas evening was doing what it does, the temperature dropping fast, the crickets starting up, the sky going from orange to purple to black. Earl put his arm around the cat against his side the way you put your arm around something you're afraid to frighten away. And then Earl Briggs, who had not cried since the morning of the 14th of September, who had not been built for public grief or private grief or any grade of grief, bent his white head over his barn cat and cried, not quietly, for a long time. Word gets around in small ranch communities the way weather does. Without anyone deciding to spread it, it just moves. Earl Briggs's neighbor, a 60-year-old woman named Dolores Vega, who ran cattle on the adjacent 300 acres with two of her grown sons, had known Earl and Margaret for 22 years. She had brought casseroles in September and October, and Earl had thanked her and put them in the refrigerator and sometimes eaten them. She came by on a Saturday morning in August and found Earl in the barn, sitting in that kitchen chair, talking, actually talking, a full sentence and a half out loud to Juniper, who was sitting on a hay bale at eye level, conducting what appeared to be an attentive professional consultation. Dolores stood in the barn doorway for a moment and watched. Then she came in and sat down on an overturned feed bucket, and the three of them spent an hour in that barn, Earl and Dolores talking more honestly than they had in months, Juniper moving between them with the authority of a creature that had arranged this meeting and expected it to go well. When Dolores left, she called her son from the truck. "Earl Briggs is going to be all right," she said. Her son asked how she knew. "He's got something to talk to," she said. "That's how it starts." There was an evening in September, the anniversary coming in 2 weeks, a fact Earl was aware of the way you're aware of a weather system building on the horizon, when something small and ordinary happened that Earl would measure everything before and after by. He'd finished supper, an actual cooked supper, eggs and toast, and a sliced tomato from the garden, the first real meal he'd made for himself in he couldn't remember how long, and he'd come out to the porch the way he and Margaret always had in the evenings, 2 chairs facing west, watching the Texas sky do what it does at the end of a day. He had his coffee. He had both chairs, the way he always had both chairs. And Juniper, unprompted and unprecedented, jumped up onto Margaret's chair. She turned around twice and settled herself in the seat, facing west, tail curled around her paws. Earl looked at her. She looked at the sunset. Earl looked at the sunset. They sat there together in the cooling evening for almost an hour, the two of them watching the sky go through every color it knew, the ranch going quiet around them. It was not the same. It was never gonna be the same. But it was something. It was an evening on the porch instead of inside avoiding the porch. That is not a small thing. That is not a small thing at all.
The coyotes had been coming closer since October. That was nothing new. Coyotes always pushed toward the ranch structures when the weather cooled and the field prey went deeper into cover. Earl had dealt with coyotes his entire life. You kept the barn doors on the back latched at night. You didn't leave food out. You listened for the horses. Standard protocol, unchanged in 6 decades. What was different this fall was the pack. Not a lone animal or a pair running together, a pack, 7 or 8 animals, bold in the way that packs get when they've been operating in an area long enough to understand its rhythms. Earl had seen their tracks in the red dirt along the east fence for 2 weeks. He'd heard them at night, not in the far hills where coyotes belong, but in the near dark, 20 yards past the barn, testing the edges of the territory the way they do when they've decided something on the inside is worth the inconvenience of the fence. He started latching the small back cat door of the barn at night. He told himself it was routine. It was the right thing to do. But he noticed Juniper looking toward the north pasture in the evenings with a focused stillness that went beyond her normal barn cat vigilance. That specific kind of stillness that means something has crossed her threshold of concern. Earl watched her watch in the dark, and he didn't like what he read in her posture. Something was building out there. Both of them could feel it.
He doesn't know what woke him. Some sound below the threshold of conscious hearing, or maybe nothing at all. Maybe just the part of him that had been a working rancher for 60 years and knew when something on the property was wrong. He came off the porch at a run the moment he heard Juniper. She was not yowling, she was screaming. That specific, terrible sound a cat makes when it is committed to a fight it cannot win, when it has placed itself between something and something else and decided that it will not move regardless of what that costs. Earl came around the corner of the barn with his flashlight, and what the beam found in the red dirt of the ranch yard would stay with him for the rest of his life. Juniper, 7 years old, 9 pounds, a barn cat, was standing her ground between the open barn door and a coyote that outweighed her by 35 pounds. Standing her ground, arched, screaming, every hair on her body vertical. 2 more coyotes circled at the edge of the flashlight's reach. She had gotten between them and the barn, between them and everything.
Earl shouted, a rancher's shout, the full-bellied roar that means business, and fired his flashlight beam directly into the lead coyote's eyes and moved fast and big. The two outer coyotes broke immediately. The lead animal held for one terrible second, and Juniper, 9 pounds of farm cat with a crooked tail and a notched ear, did not move an inch. She had decided. Earl was between her and the barn door, and she had put herself between him and the dark, and she was not moving, and she did not. The coyote broke. Earl reached her in 3 more steps. She was bloodied on her left flank, and she was shaken, and she did not stop screaming for almost 30 seconds after it was over. Earl knelt in the red dirt in the dark with her in his hands and felt her heart beat like a small, insistent fist, and said her name over and over, the way you say the name of someone you are not willing to lose.
The nearest emergency veterinary clinic was 51 miles away in Amarillo. Earl Briggs drove it in 43 minutes, at an age and with a knee that had no business driving that fast, with Juniper wrapped in Margaret's old blue dish towel in the passenger seat beside him. The same towel Margaret had used for 20 years, and that was still in the drawer in the kitchen where she'd always kept it. He kept his right hand on her the entire drive, feeling her breathing, feeling her heartbeat, talking to her the entire time in a low, continuous voice, the way you talk to someone when you need them to understand that giving up is not an option you were prepared to accept. The veterinarian on overnight call was a young woman named Dr. Alma Torres, 29 years old, who would later tell the story of a 74-year-old Texas rancher arriving at her clinic at 2 in the morning, carrying a barn cat in a dish towel, and saying, without any particular drama, "She went between me and 3 coyotes, and I need you to fix her." 2 lacerations on the left flank, a bite to the left shoulder, blood loss that was serious but survivable. Dr. Torres worked for 40 minutes while Earl Briggs sat in the waiting room in his night clothes and boots and did not move and did not speak, and held Margaret's dish towel in his hands and waited in the way that only people who have already sat in a waiting room waiting for news that destroyed their life know how to wait.
Dolores Vega arrived at the Amarillo Veterinary Clinic at 3:15 in the morning because Earl had called her from the parking lot before he went inside in case things went wrong and someone needed to know. She brought her son Mateo, 28, who had grown up on the ranch next door and thought of Earl as something between a neighbor and a grandfather. The night vet tech, a young man named Carson who had been doing overnight shifts for 2 years and had seen a great many things come through those doors, found himself checking on the old man in the waiting room more often than protocol required. By 4 a.m., without anyone organizing it or announcing it, there were 4 people in that waiting room for a barn cat that most of the world would not have considered worth the drive. Dr. Torres came through the swinging doors at 4:22 a.m. and said the words, stable, stitched, resting, strong heart for a cat that's been through something tonight. And Earl Briggs received them with his eyes closed and his head bowed and said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "She didn't move." Dr. Torres said she didn't understand. Earl said, 3 coyotes. She didn't move an inch. Dr. Torres looked at him across that fluorescent waiting room and understood she was in the presence of something that didn't need explaining, only witnessing.
They let him back at 5 a.m. Juniper was in a small recovery kennel, bandaged along her left side, an IV line in her left foreleg, lying on a clean white towel under a warming lamp. She was awake. That was the first thing Earl registered. She was awake, and her pale amber-green eyes found him the moment he stepped through the door, with the same direct, immediate attention they always had. the same look that had been reading him from the top of that hay bale since May. Earl sat down on the stool Dr. Torres put beside the kennel, and he put 2 fingers through the kennel door, and Juniper moved, slowly, carefully, protecting her bandaged side, and pressed her face against his fingers. He could feel her purring before he could hear it, that vibration, that small, mechanical, ancient sound that cats make when they are telling you something that they have no other language for. Earl sat in that back room of a veterinary clinic in Amarillo, Texas at 5 in the morning, smelling of antiseptic and Red River Valley red dirt, and he felt that purr move through his fingers and up his arm, and he understood, in the specific and wordless way that grief teaches you to understand things, that something had come back that he had been afraid was gone. Not Margaret. He knew better than to confuse the gifts, but something, the particular warmth of being chosen, of being worth staying for.
Juniper came home to the farmhouse. Not the barn, the farmhouse. Earl carried her in on the 3rd day after the clinic, still bandaged, still moving carefully, and set her on the old sofa in the front room, and she looked around the house with her amber-green eyes for a long moment, reading every room from where she sat, and then she tucked her front paws under her chest in the compact, decided way she had, and she stayed. She heeled on the sofa, and then on the windowsill, and then on the foot of Earl's bed, where she slept from that point forward. The barn got a new cat in the spring, a young gray Tom that Dolores Vega brought over in a carrier, and Juniper supervised his training from the farmhouse window with the air of a retired executive keeping tabs on her replacement. Earl fixed the gate on the east fence. He called his brother in Midland. He agreed to drive into Amarillo on the first Tuesday of each month for a widowers group at the First Methodist. Dolores's suggestion, gently made, finally accepted. He still made 1 cup of coffee in the pot designed for 2. He still felt the weight of the other chair on the porch. Grief doesn't resolve. Anyone who tells you it resolves is selling something. But Earl Briggs sat on his porch in the evenings with a cat in his lap instead of alone, and the flat Texas sky went through its colors the way it always had, indifferent and gorgeous, and he watched it all the way to dark. He was still here. They both were. And on 240 acres of High Plains, Texas, in the specific arithmetic of 1 old man and 1 farm cat, that turned out to be enough.